Okay, dear students, good day. Today we are going to continue with our lecture number 14 in Psycholinguistics, and it's going to be a continuation of our previous lecture. I did explain in the previous lecture that we're going to continue studying the interspecies communication, the forms of communication, the functions of communication, and the evolution of communication. So all of these things will matter a lot when we continue going on ahead. So when we were studying about how animals require language. So interspecies communication would be the first one, then forms of communication would be the second, forms of functions then of communication, how communication functions, and how the evolution works. So first we would go about with forms of communication. Now forms of communication, the best known forms of communication involve the display of distinctive body parts or distinctive bodily movements. So first thing, even in animals now, we are still studying about how animals communicate with each other. So their best known form of communicating would involve the display of the distinctive body parts or the distinctive bodily movements that they would make. For example, the herring gull. Now, the herring gull is a bird. Now, how does it work is from parent to nest to chick. From the parent bird to the nest to the chick. Now, brightly colored bill would be from the parents, yellow and a red spot of food. That would the parent would be bringing the food to the child, but how is it communicating? It's communicating through color. So how would the child recognize that the parent is bringing it? Because he will look at the brightly colored bill, which would be yellow with a red spot in a herring gull, and it would be carrying food. So the child would automatically the chick would automatically understand that the parent is bringing food for it. Now tap the bill on the ground, it would tap the bill on the ground, also indicating to the chick that the parent has brought food for the child. Now accidental swallowing of pieces of brightly colored plastic or glass is a common cause of mortality among gull chicks. So sometimes herring gull में वो swallow कर जाते हैं brightly colored plastic pieces या glass के यही सोच के कि अगर येलो या रेड bright colors देखेंगे, so thinking that maybe it's the parent feeding them. So and then by those accidents those chicks would die. So but they are used to seeing the parent bringing them food like that. Now another important form of communication is bird song. Now bird song is very important. Usually it's performed mainly by males. And though in some species the sexes sing in alternation also. So sometimes, usually it's performed by males, but though in some species the sexes sing it in alternation. This is called duetting and serves mainly purposes of strengthening, pair bonding and repelling competitors. So birdsong is just the best known case of vocal communication. Other instances include the warning cries of many monkeys, the territorial calls of gibbons, and the mating calls for many species of frogs. So olfactory communication. Now olfactory communication, for example, many mammals, now there are glands that generate distinctive and long-lasting smells, would be a way of communicating also, and have corresponding behaviors that leave these spells in places where they have been. So then in bees, bees carry with them a pouch of material from the hive which they release as they re-enter, the smell of which indicates if they are a part of the hive and grants their safe entry into the hive also. Functions of communication. Now in functions of communication, the agonistic interaction, everything to do with contest and aggression between individuals. Many species have distinctive threat displays that are made during competitive over food, mates or territory. Much bird song functions in this way. So courtship ritual, signals made by members of one sex to attract or maintain the attention of potential mates, or to cement a pair bond. Now, food-related signals. Many animals make food calls that attract a mate or offspring, or members of a social group generally, to a food source. Perhaps the most elaborate food-related signal is the dance language of honeybees, studied by Carl von Frisch. Alarm calls. Now, animals have alarm calls also, a form of communication. Now, alarm calls, signals made in the presence of a threat from a predator, allowing all members of a social group, and often members of other species, to run for cover, become immobile, or gather into a group to reduce the risk of attack. Now, metacommunications, signals that modify the meaning of subsequent signals. The best known example is the play face in dogs, which signals that a subsequent aggressive signal is part of a play fight rather than a serious aggressive episode. So evolution of that would be that part. Then the next part would be evolution of communication. Now, how does evolution of communication occur? By comparing related species within groups. It is found that movements and body parts that in the primitive forms had no communicative function could be captured in a context where communication would be functional for one or both partners, and could evolve into a more elaborate, specialized form. So the early ethologists assumed that communication occurred for the good of the species as a whole, but this would require a process of group selection, which is believed to be mathematically impossible in the evolution of sexually reducing animals. So, interpretation of animal communication. Now, how do we interpret animal communication? It is important to note that while many gestures and actions have common stereotypical meanings, researchers regularly seem to find that animal communication is often more complex and subtle than previously believed, and that the same gesture may have multiple distinct meanings depending on context and other behaviors. So generalizations such as X and means Y are often but not always accurate. For example, dog's tail wag, that would be something of importance. Then animal communication and human behavior. Now, how does animal communication and human behavior work? Now, ethologists have argued that facial gestures such as smiling, grimacing, and the eyebrow flash on greeting are universal human communicative signals that can be related to corresponding signals in other primates. So animal communication versus and human behavior. So when we are smiling, we'll smile when we are happy, we'll grimace if we are sad or angry. An eyebrow flash means when we are raising our eyebrow, that means that we're saying, questioning you about something, or making a question out of it. Communicative signals can be related to corresponding signals in other primates that you would, being another human being, you would understand. Now, humans also often seek to mimic animals' communicative signals in order to interact with the animals. Now, for example, cats have a mild affiliation response involving closing their eyes. Humans often close their eyes towards a pet cat to establish a tolerant relationship. Now, stroking, petting, and rubbing pet animals are all actions that probably work through their natural patterns of interspecies communication. Animal communication and linguistics. Now, how does that occur? Human languages are characterized for having a double articulation. It means that complex linguistic expressions can be broken down into meaningful elements, such as morphemes and words, which in turn are composed of smallest meaningless phonetic elements or phonemes. Animal signals, however, do not exhibit this dual structure. So in general, animal utterances are responses to external stimuli and do not refer to matters removed in time and space. So matters of relevance at a distance, such as distant food sources, they would tend to be indicated to other individuals by body language instead. For example, wolf activity before a hunt or information conveyed in honeybee dance language. So human language is largely learned culturally, while animal communication systems are known largely by instinct. Now, in contrast to human language, animal communication systems are usually not able to express conceptual generalizations. Human languages combine elements to produce new messages, a property known as creativity. Now, one factor is that much human language growth is based upon conceptual ideas and hypothetical structures, both being far greater capabilities in humans than animals. So this appears far less common in animal communication systems. So wild children and language. Wild, what do you mean by wild now? A feral child, wild or undomesticated, that means a child who is not brought up in a family environment. A human child who, from a very young age, has lived in isolation from human contact and has remained unaware of human social behavior and unexposed to language. Like you have a very good example, like in our stories that we have of Tarzan. Tarzan was considered to be a human child who at a very young age was isolated from human contact and remained unaware of human social behavior, and he did not know anything about language also. So that also includes children who have been purposefully kept apart from human society, kept in a room in solitary confinement. ये उन बच्चों के लिए भी काउंट होता है जो बच्चों को स्पेशली सोसाइटी से दूर रखा जाता है, एंड दे आर केप्ट इन सॉलिटरी कन्फाइनमेंट, यानी उनको सिर्फ अपने ही रूम में रखा जाता है. हाउ डू दे लर्न लैंग्वेज? हाउ वुड दे लर्न लैंग्वेज if they don't communicate or socialize with people? How would a child acquire language? So language acquisition in the wild would be quite obviously feral. Isolated and confined children who entered isolation before they could learn to talk never learned human language while in the wild, since they had nobody to teach them. Now they cannot spontaneously learn language. वो खुद से नहीं सीख सकते until they have somebody who can teach them the language. Now what many feral children do learn is to mimic animal sounds, and especially the sounds of their host families. So those that have lived with wolves are often reported, like Mowgli was a famous story, childhood story that we read, and Mowgli was supposed to be brought up, he lived with wolves and he was supposed to be brought up with wolves. So he learned how to make their sounds, lived with wolves, and they're often reported as barking or whining. And those that have lived with wild on their own are sometimes adept at recognizing and imitating the sounds of many different birds. So what makes feral children particularly interesting to scientists researching the critical period hypothesis is whether or not they learn to speak after their return to human society. So उनके लिए researchers के लिए ये चीज़ important है कि okay, they don't know how to speak the language at that time, but when they return to society, how do they learn at that point? Do they start learning how to speak a language? Now the critical period hypothesis would be that contends that the ability to learn a language is limited to the years before puberty, after which, as a result of neurological changes in the brain, the ability is lost. Unless they are exposed to language in the early years of life, human lost much of their innate ability to learn a language, and especially its grammatical system. So contends the ability कि language learning जो है आपकी younger age में जो है start होती है, which as a result of neurological changes in the brain, the ability is lost after that. Now unless they are exposed to language at an early stage of their life, then humans would lose the ability to learn a language, especially in the grammatical form. Now, what language to teach? That is another question. Since language acquisition is so difficult for feral children who've missed out on the critical period, some attempts have been made to teach children sign language. However, sign language is a language in its own right and requires the same neurological development. So after returning to civilization, the ability of feral children to learn language on their return to human society is very varied. Some children acquire normal language ability, but only if found before the onset of puberty. For example, Isabel, in 2 years, she covered the stages of learning that usually takes a child 6 years to learn. Now, some also learn to speak normally, but it is assumed that they could speak before their period of isolation. So, famous examples, the list, the Romanian dog boy and Ugandan monkey boy were one of those that we are going to study about. Now, human language versus animal communication. That's something that we're going to study right now. How human language would compare to animal communication. Now, facts about human language. Human is capable of producing brand new sentences never before uttered in the history of the universe. So they are capable of producing brand new sentences or words that have never been uttered before. Now, mental grammar. Children develop complex grammars rapidly and without formal instruction, and grow up to give consistent interpretations to novel sentence constructions that they have never before encountered. That would be universal grammar. So that would be mental grammar, that the children, they develop the complex grammars rapidly and without any formal instructions, and they understand that also, and they can construct according to that. So universal grammar would be, now, vocal auditory channel, designs features of language. Human communication utilizes sounds produced by a vocal system and received by an auditory system. The system leaves the rest of the body free to engage in other activities. And for example, people also talk in the dark. So sounds are transmitted in all directions. The auditory system with 2 ears make it possible to detect and locate the source of sounds with precision. So that is important for survival. Transitory would be sounds are heard and they rapidly disappear, allowing successive exchanges. So sounds are heard और फिर एकदम से disappear हो जाते हैं, and that allows successive exchanges between humans or animals. Then interchangeable. Senders of sounds can also act as receivers and vice versa. Senders of sound can also act as receiving and vice versa. They could interchange language. Then total feedback would be the senders of sound signals can also hear the sounds they are sending, so they can adjust or change the signals also. Then specialization, the biological power of language signals is small, but the result of or consequence can be immense. The signals are produced solely for the purpose of communication. So semanticity, the sound signals are meaningful. The series of sounds are assigned with meaning. Arbitrariness, there is no necessary connection between the form of the signal and the thing being referred to is onomatopic words. Convention, now in convention the system and meaning are conventional, agreed upon by the speech community. Convention would be when the system and the meanings are conventional and they're agreed upon, everybody agrees in their speech community about certain rules or certain sounds and words. Directness, discreteness would be when you are directing a word. So discreteness, the sounds that make up the signal can be separated. Sentences can be parsed into phrases, phrases into words, and words into morphemes, morphemes into phonemes. Displacement. Human beings can communicate about things, activities, and ideas that are not tied to a certain place or time. They even talk about things that do not exist. Productivity. The system is open for new inventions and development. New words, terminologies, expressions are coined or created. Socialization would be, or traditional transmission would be, human language is not something inborn. It's not something that a child is born with. Human beings learn their first language through a process of socialization in a teaching learning environment. So they socialize with people, and that's how they learn to process a language in a teaching and learning environment. Duality of patterning. The order of sounds that make up a signal may be changed to form a new word because they consist of phonological elements. Now phonemes, they do not carry meaning. For example, tap, pat, and apt. Prevarication, a message may be truth or a lie or nonsensical. Human beings can lie and negate. The negation occurs only in verbal language. Then comes reflexivity. Reflexivity would be human language can be used to talk about itself. Parts of speech are correctly used unconsciously. For example, run is a verb, room is a noun. The system can be learned. A speaker can learn another language and use it. It is possible to translate from one language to another. That is another form. You can translate languages from one to another by giving meaning. So the systems can be learned. You can learn systems by translating them. A speaker can learn another language and use it also. So this would all be about the systems and how they work. Now we would further go on to study about the progress of psycholinguistics. Now, progress in determining how linguistic representations are derived from print will be made as researchers move beyond the short monosyllabic words that have been the focus of much current research and modeling. Now, in addition, experimental techniques that involve the brief presentation of stimuli and the tracking of eye movements are contributing useful information. So in addition to experimental techniques, even though that we are experimenting with different techniques that involve the brief presentation of stimuli, the tracking of the eye movements also are contributing useful information of how we can predict them. Now these methods supplement the naming tasks and lexical decision tasks that are used in much of the research in single word reading. Although many questions remain to be answered, it is clear that the visual representations provided by print rapidly make contact with the representations stored in the mental lexicon. Now, once this contact has been made, it matters little whether the initial input was by ear or by ear, by eye or by ear. Now, the principles and processing procedures are much the same. How the processing procedures work, they are, and the principles would be very similar. So the mental lexicon. Now the mental lexicon, so far in discussing how listeners and readers access information in the mental lexicon, we have not said much about the nature of the information that they access. So what we're doing is we're just talking about how listeners and readers would access information by the mental lexicon, but we're not saying about how they would access that information. Now, it is to this topic that we now turn. We are going to study about that. One question which relates to the trade-off between computation and storage in language processing is whether the mental lexicon is organized by morphemes or by words. So one question which we would start with is which relates to the trade-off Now, a trade-off means an exchange between computation and storage in language processing. How we store the language while processing it, and the computation. Now, this is whether the mental lexicon is organized by morphemes or by words. So all of this would relate to that. Under a word-based view, the lexicon contains representations of all words that the language user knows. Now, whether they are single morpheme words such as cat or polymorphemic words such as beautifully. Supporting this view, Tyler, Marson, Wilson, and Reito and Haney in 1988 found that spoken word recognition performance was related to when the word began to diverge from other words in the mental lexicon as predicted by the cohort model. So, but was not related to morphemic predictors of where recognition should take place. So under a morpheme-based view, in contrast, the lexicon is organized in terms of morphemes such as beauty, full, and ly. Beauty, and then you could add full to it, or ly beauty, fully. Okay? So in this view, complex words are processed and represented in terms of such units. Beauty, beautiful, beautifully. The study by Taft and Forrester in 1975 brought morphological issues to the attention of many psychologists and pointed to some forms of morpheme-based storage. As mentioned earlier, these researchers found that non-words such as wife, which is the stem of revive, were difficult to reject in a lexical decision task. Now, participants also had trouble with items such as dejuvenate, which, although not a real word, consists of genuine prefix together with a genuine root. You do know what a prefix and a root is. Prefixes are put before a word, and roots are the base of the word, usually in the center, and then there is a suffix at the end. Now, Taft and Forrester interpreted their results to suggest that access to the mental lexical is based on root morphemes, and that obligatory decomposition must precede word recognition for polyformate words. Now, more recent studies suggest that there are in fact two routes to recognition for polymorphemic words, one based on morphological analysis and the other based on whole word storage. Now, in one instantation of this dual root view, morphologically complex words are simultaneously analyzed as whole words and in terms of morphemes. In the model of Worm in 1997, Worm and Ross 2001, for instance, the system maintains a representation of which morphemes can combine and in what ways. So a potential word root is checked against a list of free roots that have combined in the past with the prefix in question. So in another instantation of the dual root view, some morphologically complex words are decomposed and others are not. For example, Marson, Wilson, Tyler, Walker, and Older 1994 argued that semantically opaque words such as organize and casualty are treated by listeners and readers as monoformic and are not decomposed no matter how many morphemes they technically contain. So they aren't. It doesn't matter how many morphemes they contain. Now, commonly encountered words may also be treated as wholes rather than in terms of morphemes. Now, Karmaza et al. In 1988, Skruder et Bain in 1995, although morphological decomposition may not always take place, the evidence we have reviewed suggests that the lexicon is organized in part in terms of morphemes. Now, this organization helps explain our ability to make some sense of stilthy and toves, like we studied before in a previous lecture. So ambiguous words or those with more than one meaning might be expected to cause difficulties in lexical processing. Researchers have been interested in ambiguity because studies of these issues may provide insight into whether processing at a lexical level is influenced by information at higher levels or whether it is modular. Now, in the former case, comprehenders, people who understand language, would be expected to access only the contextually appropriate meaning of a word. In the latter case, all meanings should be retrieved and context should have its effects only after the initial processing has taken place. So the original version of the cohort model of Marlson, Wilson, and Welsh in 1978 adopts an interactive view when it states that context acts directly on cohort membership. However, later versions of cohort theory of say Marlson and Wilson in 1987, 1990, Moss and Marlson in 93 hold that context has its effect at a later integrative stage. So initially it appears both meanings of an ambiguous morpheme are looked up in many cases. This may even occur when the preceding context would seem to favor one meaning over the other. Now, in one representative study, participants read sentences such as Jack tried the punch, but he didn't think it tasted very good. After the word punch had been presented, an uppercase letter string was presented and participants were asked to decide whether or not it was a real word. Now, of interest were lexical decisions, targets such as hit, which are related to an unintended meaning of the ambiguous word, and drink, which are related to the intended meaning. So when the target was presented immediately after the participant had read punch, performance was speeded up on both hit and drink. Now, this result suggests that even the contextually inappropriate meaning of the ambiguous morpheme was activated. The initial lack of contextual effects in this and other studies supports the idea that lexical access is a modular process, uninfluenced by higher level syntactic and semantic constraints. Now, importantly, Gernbacher and Faust in 1991 found a different pattern of results. When the lexical decision task was delayed by a half second or so, but still preceded the following word of the sentence. So they found a difference when they were experimenting. Now, in this case, drink remained active, but hit did not. So Gernbacher and Faust interpreted these results to mean that comprehenders initially access all meanings of an ambiguous word, but then actively suppress the meaning or meanings that does not fit the context. Now, this suppression process, they contend, is more efficient in better comprehenders than in poorer comprehenders. Because the inappropriate meaning is quickly suppressed, the reader or listener is typically not aware of the ambiguity. So although all meanings of an ambiguous word may be accessed initially in many cases, this may not always be so. So for example, when one meaning of an ambiguous word is much more frequent than the other, or when the context very strongly favors one meaning, the other meaning may show little or no activation. It has thus been difficult to provide a clear answer to the question of whether lexical access is modular or not. The preceding discussions consider words that have two or more unrelated meanings. Now, more common are polysemous words which have several senses that are related to one another. Now, for example, paper can refer to a substance made of wood pulp or an article that is typically written on that substance but that nowadays may be written and published electronically. So, for example, paper can refer to substance made of wooden pulp that we see in our form of the paper that we use in our copies, or an article. You can write a paper, please write a paper, that means an article that is typically written on a substance, but that, or maybe written and published electronically. So, processing a polysemous word in one of its senses can make it harder to subsequently comprehend the word in another of its senses. Now, that one sense can be activated, and the other suppressed suggests to these researchers that at least some senses have separate representations, just as the different meanings of a morpheme, like punch, have separate representations. So you can see that they can have a separate representation, just like the morpheme. Then when we understood punch, you can understand punch as punching somebody, or punch as a drink, a mixture of fruit flavors. So problems with ambiguity are potentially greater in bilinguals than in monolinguals. For example, leak has a single sense for a monolingual speaker of English, but it has another meaning, layperson, for one who has knows Dutch also. So when asked to decide whether print words are English or not, and when the experimental items included some exclusively Dutch words, Dutch-English bilinguals were found to have more difficulty with words such as leek than with appropriate control words such as zuivel, which is dairy, that they could distinguish between them. Now, such results suggest that Dutch lexicon is activated along with the English one in this situation. Now, although optimal performance could be achieved by deactivating the irrelevant language, bilinguals are sometimes unable to do this. Now, further evidence for this view comes from a study in which Russian-English bilinguals were asked in Russian to pick up objects such as a marku, a stamp, when a marker was also present. Now, an object whose English name is similar to marku, people sometimes looked at it before looking at the stamp and carrying out the instruction. So they would be confused. They would take that word because it has a similar pronunciation, so they would take that word to be said as marker, and they would glance at the marker also and maybe try to attempt to pick that up also. Even though that they know that in Russian that it means marku means a stamp. So, although English was not used during the experimental session, the bilinguals appeared unable to ignore the irrelevant lexicon. Now, information about the meanings of words and about the concepts that they represent is also linked to lexical representations. Comprehension of sentences and discourse. Now, important as word recognition is, understanding language requires far more than adding the meanings of the individual words together. So we must combine the meanings in ways that honor the grammar of the language and that are sensitive to the possibility that language is being used in a metaphoric or non-literal manner. You can see Cassiari and Gluckberg in 1994. Psycholinguistics have addressed the phenomena of sentence comprehension in different ways, of how sentences are understood. Now, some theorists have focused on the fact that the sentence comprehension system continually creates novel representations of novel messages, following the constraints of a language's grammar, and does so with remarkable speed. Now, others have emphasized that the comprehension system is sensitive to a vast range of information, including grammatical, lexical, and conceptual, as well as knowledge of the speaker, writer, and of the world in general. So, theorists in the former group of Ford, Burns, Bresnan, and Kaplan in 1982, Fraser and Rayner in 1982, Pritchett in 1992 have constructed modular serial models that describe how the processor quickly constructs one or more representations of a sentence based on a restricted range of information that is guaranteed to be relevant to its interpretation, primarily grammatical information. Now, any such representation is then quickly interpreted and evaluated using the full range of information that might be relevant. Now, theorists in later groups, for example, MacDonald, Perlmutter, and Seidenberg in 94, Tanner, Sauss, and Trueswell in 95 have constructed parallel models, often of a connectionist nature. Now, describing how the processor uses all relevant information to quickly evaluate the full range of possible interpretations of a sentence. So you can see Pickering's in 1999 for the discussion. Neither of the two approaches just described provides a full account of how the sentence processing mechanism works. Modular models, by and large, do not adequately deal with how interpretation occurs. So how the full range of information relevant to interpretation is integrated, or how the initial representation is revised when necessary. So in 98, Ferreira and Fodor for a beginning on the latter question also. So parallel models, for the most part, do not adequately deal with how the processor constructs or activates the various interpretations whose competition evaluation they describe. You can see Fraser in 1995 for reference. However, both approaches have motivated bodies of research that have advanced our knowledge of language comprehension, and new models are being developed that have the promise of overcoming the limitations of the models that have guided research in the past. So you can see Gibson 1998, Juravsky in 1996, and Vos and Kempen in 2000. Now, phenomena common to reading and listening comprehension. Now, comprehension of written and spoken language can be difficult. Understanding the written and spoken language both can be difficult, in part because it is not always easy to identify the constituents, phrases of a sentence, and the ways in which they relate to one another. The place of a particular constituent within the grammatical structure may be temporarily or permanently ambiguous. Studies of how people resolve grammatical ambiguities, like studies of how they resolve lexical ambiguities, have provided insights into the process of language comprehension. Consider the sentence, "The second wife will claim the inheritance belongs to her." When the inheritance first appears, it could be interpreted as either the direct object of claim or the subject of belongs. Now, Fraser and Rayner now found that readers' eyes fixated for longer than usual on the verb belongs, which disambiguates the sentence. So they interpreted this result to mean that readers first interpreted the inheritance as a direct object. Readers were disrupted when they had to revise this initial interpretation to the one in which the inheritance is subject of belongs. So following Beaver, in 1970, Fraser and Rayner described their readers as being led down a garden path. Now, readers are led down the garden path, Fraser and Rayner claimed, because the direct object analysis is structurally simpler than the other possible analysis. So these researchers proposed a principal minimal attachment which defined structurally simpler, and they claimed that structural simplicity guides all initial analysis. In this view, the sentence processor constructs a single analysis of a sentence and attempts to interpret it, to translate it or understand it. Now, the first analysis is the one that requires the fewest applications of grammatical rules to attach each incoming word into the structure being built. Now, it is the automatic consequence of an effort to get some analysis constructed as soon as possible. So, many researchers have tested and confirmed the minimal attachment principle for a variety of sentence types. For example, in Fraser and Clifton in 1996, for a review also. So minimal attachment is not the only principle that has been proposed as governing how readers and listeners use grammatical knowledge in parsing. Now, another principle that has received substantial support is late closure. Like in Fraser in 1987, Fraser and Rayner in 1982 provided some early support for this principle by showing disruption on the, now this part in the slide students is a little bit erased, so there is another word covering it that is a misprint. So you need to differentiate that Fraser and Rayner in 1982 provided some early support for this. These are the three words that are covered, support for this. Principle by showing disruption on the phrase seems like in since J always jogs a mile seems like a very short distance to him. Now here a mile is first taken to be the direct object of jogs because the processor tries to relate it to the phrase currently being processed. Reading is disrupted when a mile must be reanalyzed as the subject of seems. Now, another principle is some version of prefer argument. Abney in 1989, Konechny, Hemforth, Schaeffner, or Straub, Pritchett in 1992. Grammars often distinguish between arguments and adjuncts. An argument is a phrase whose relation to a verb or another argument assigner is lexically specified. So an adjunct is related to what it modifies in a less specific fashion. With the sentence, Joe expresses his interest in the car. The preference argument principle predicts that a reader will attach in the car the noun interest rather than to the verb express. So even though the latter analysis is structurally simpler and preferred according to the minimal attachment. So in the car is an argument of interest. The nature of its relation to interest is specified by the word interest, but an adjunct of express. It states the location of the action just as it would for any action. So there is substantial evidence that the argument analysis is preferred in the end. So Clifton, Spear, and Abney have researched that in 1991. And however, some evidence suggests a brief initial preference for the minimal attachment analysis. Clifton et al. In 1991, you can see that as reference. So long distance dependencies like ambiguities can cause problems in the parsing of language. Language gains much of its expressive power from its recursive properties. Sentences can be placed inside sentences without limit. This means that related phrases can be distant from one another. Many linguists describe constructions like, whom did you see at the zoo? And the girl I saw T at the zoo was my sister, as having an empty element, a trace symbolized by T. So in the position where the moved element, whom and the girl, must be interpreted. Now, psycholinguists who have adopted this analysis ask how the sentence processor discovers the relation between the moved element or filler and the trace or the gap. Now, one possibility J.D. Fodor in 1978 suggested is that the processor might delay filler gap assignment as long as possible. However, there is evidence that the processor actually identifies the gap as soon as possible, an active filler strategy, Fraser in 1987. Now, the active filler strategy is closely related to minimal attachment. For both strategies, attempt to find some grammatical analysis of a sentence as soon as possible. So, but the active filler strategy may not be the whole story. Pickering and Berry in 1991, and Boland and Tannenhaus and Garnsey and Carlson in 1995 proposed that the latter called a direct assignment strategy, according to which a filler is semantically interpreted as soon as a reader or listener encounters the verb to which it is related without waiting for the gap position. Now, evidence for this strategy comes from a study in which Boland et al. Presented sentences word by word, asking readers to indicate when and if a sentence became unacceptable. An implausible sentence like, "Which public library did John contribute some cheap liquor to last week?" tended to be rejected right on the word liquor, before the position of the gap. So most of the phenomena discussed so far show that the preferences of certain structural relations play an important role in sentence comprehension, in understanding the sentences. However, as syntactic theory has shifted away from describing particular structural configurations and towards specifying lexical information that constrains possible grammatical relations, many psycholinguists have proposed that the human sentence processor is primarily guided by information about specific words that is stored in the lexicon. Now, the research on comprehenders' preference for arguments discussed earlier is one example of this move. Spicy, Knowlton, and Sidavi in 1995 demonstrated effects of particular categories of lexical items, as well as effects of discourse structure. In the comprehension of sentences like "the salesman glanced at A," or "the customer with suspicion ripped jeans," the prepositional phrases "with suspicion" or "with ripped jeans" would modify either the verb glance or the noun customer. The salesman glanced at the customer with ripped jeans, or the salesman glanced at a customer with suspicion. So the prepositional phrases "with suspicion" or "with ripped jeans" could modify either the verb glance or the noun customer. Now, minimal attachment favors the former analysis, but Spivey, Nolt, and Sidavi showed that this held true only for action verbs like smash down, not for perception verbs like glance at. Now, the researchers further noted that an actual preference for noun phrase modification only appeared when the noun had the indefinite article a. This outcome, they suggested, points to the importance of discourse factors, such as whether an entity is newly referred to or not in sentence comprehension. So some theorists, like Altman and Steedman in 1998, have proposed that contextual appropriateness guides parsing and indeed is responsible for the effects that have previously been attributed to structural factors such as minimal attachment. So the basic claim of their referential theory is that for a phrase to modify a definite noun phrase, there must be two or more possible reference of the noun phrase in the discourse context. So for instance, in the sentence, "the burglar blew open a safe with the dynamite" treatment with the dynamite as modifying a safe is claimed to presuppose the existence of two or more safes, one of which contains dynamite. So if multiple safes had been mentioned, the sentence processor must either infer the existence of other safes or must analyze the phrase in another way. For example, as specifying an instrument of blow open. Now, supporters of referential theory have argued that the out-of-context preferences that have been taken to support principles like minimal attachment disappear when sentences are presented in appropriate discourse contexts. So in one study, Altman and Steedman examined how long readers took on sentences like "the burglar blew open the safe with the dynamite, new lock, and made off with the loot" in context that had introduced either one safe or two safes, one with a new lock. So the version containing "with the dynamite" was read faster than the one safe context, where the phrase modified the verb and thus satisfied minimal attachment. Now the version containing "with the new lock" was read faster in the too safe context, fitting differential theory. So many studies have examined effects like the one just described. It is clear that one of the definite noun phrase, when the discourse context contains two possible referents, disrupts reading. So this result shows once again that interpretation is nearly immediate and that reading is disrupted when unambiguous interpretation is blocked. A context that provides two referents can eliminate the disruption observed out of context when a phrase must modify a noun, at least when the out-of-context structural preference is weak. So when the out-of-context bias is strong, as in the case of reduced relative clauses like Beaver's 1970 and horse raced past the barn fell, a context that satisfies the presumed referential presumptions of a modifier reduce the amounts of disruption rather than eliminating it. Now, given the wide variety of factors that seem to affect sentence comprehension, psycholinguistics have developed lexicalist constraints-based theories of sentence processing. Now, MacDonald did that in 1994. Tannhaus and Truswell did that in 1995. Now, these theories, which are described and sometimes implemented in consectionist terms, assume that multiple plausible interpretations of a sentence are available to the processor. So each possible interpretation receives activation or inhibition from some knowledge sources, as well as generally being inhabited by other interpretations. So competition among the interpretations eventually results in the dominance of a single one. Increased competition is responsible for the effects that the theories discussed earlier have contributed to the need to revise an analysis. Now, constraint-based theories can accommodate influences of specified lexical information, context, verb category, and many other factors, and they have encouraged the search for additional influences. Now, however, they may not be the final word on sentence processing. So these theories correctly predict that a variety of factors can reduce or eliminate garden path effects when a temporarily ambiguous sentence is resolved in favor of an analysis that is not normally preferred, for example, non-minimal attachment. But the constraint-based theories also predict that these factors will create garden paths when the sentence is resolved in favor of its normally preferred analysis. Now, this may not always be the case, but it does affect it. Okay, so this will not maybe always be the case. Competitive constraint-based theories, like other connectionist theories, grant a major role to frequency. So frequent construction should be more readily activated by appropriate sources of information than less common constructions are. So supporting this view, readers understand sentences like "the award accepted by the man was very impressive" more readily. When the first verb is frequently used as a passive participle, as accept is, then when the verb is not frequently used as a passive participle, as with entertain. So Truswell 1996 is a reference for that. Then also reduced relative clause sentences, such as "the rancher could see that the nervous cattle moved into the crowded pen, were afraid of the cowboys," are read more rapidly when the verb of the complement sentence is more often used as a transitive verb, push, and then when it is more often used as an intertransitive verb, move, MacDonald's in 1994. The frequency of particular constructions may not always predict comprehension preferences and comprehension difficulty. So you have these references to check out. Now, however, theorists such as Jafafsky in 1996 have made a strong case that the frequency of exposure to certain constructions is a major factor guiding sentence comprehension. So competitive constraint-based theories have also emphasized discourse and situational context as constraints on sentence comprehension. Researchers have taken advantage of the fact that listeners quickly direct their eyes to the reference of what they hear, as shown by the Elopina et al. In 1998 study mentioned in the earlier discussion of spoken word recognition, to study how comprehension is guided by situational context. So Spivey, Trenahaus, Eberhard, and Sidaivi in 2001 found that when a listener hears a command like "put the cup on the napkin under the book," the eyes move quickly to an empty napkin when the context contains just one cup, even if the cup had been on a napkin. Now this result suggests that on the napkin was taken as the goal argument of put. However, when the context contains two cups, only one on a napkin, the eyes do not move to an empty napkin. The result suggests that the situational context overrode the default preference to take the on phrase as an argument. So related work explores how quickly knowledge of the roles objects typically plays in events is used in determining the references of phrases. Now, in one study, people observed a scene on a video display and judged the appropriateness of an auditory sentence describing the scene. Now, their eyes moved faster to the relevant target when the verb in the sentence was commonly used by the target item. So, for instance, when people heard "the boy will eat the cake," their eyes moved more quickly to a picture of the cake than when they heard "the boy will move the cake." So the research just described shows how quickly listeners integrate grammatical and situational knowledge in understanding a sentence. So integration is also important across sentence boundaries. Sentences come in context and discourses, and the entire text or discourse is relevant to the messages conveyed. So researchers have examined how readers and listeners determine whether referring expressions, especially pronouns and noun phrases, pick out a new entity or one that was introduced earlier in the discourse. So they have studied how readers and listeners determine the relations between one assertion and earlier assertions, including determining what unexpressed assertions follow as implications of what was heard or read. Many studies have examined how readers and listeners create a non-linguistic representation of the content. So one that supports the functions of determining reference, relevance, and implications. So you can see the text and discourse comprehension in Gernsbacher in 1994, and also Garnham in 1999 and Sanford in 1999 for summaries of this work. So much research on text comprehension has been guided by the work of Kinston, who has proposed a series of models of the process by which the prepositions that make up the semantic interpretations of individual sentences are integrated into larger structures. Now, his models describe ways in which readers could abstract the main threads of a discourse and intermissing connections, constrained by limitations of short-term memory and guided by how arguments overlap across prepositions and by linguistic cues signaled by the text. Okay, so students, I think that is enough for today. We will continue the rest of the lecture in our next one. After we have 2 more lectures of psycholinguistics, then we will follow on to move back to social linguistics also. But in the meantime, I would like you to check out these references and then study these slides carefully so that all of the content is very clear and understandable to you. Thank you so much.